Lu Xiaojun is arguably one of the most famous and favoured weightlifters by the public the sport of weightlifting has ever seen. He is as close to an icon as the sport can manifest in real life, thanks in large part to his success as one of the greatest weightlifters ever. Lu is China's most successful weightlifter in the modern era, with 13 world records, multiple world titles and 3 Olympic medals to his name. On the 22nd of October, Lu tested positive for EPO or erythropoietin. This test was carried out by the ITA, aka the International Testing Agency, in what can only be described as a spec ops mission into China. EPO is synonymous with aerobic based sports and not typically seen in power or strength sports. EPO, when used synthetically, increases the number of red blood cells to mimic its endogenous properties. As a medicine, it's typically used for patients with chronically low red blood cells, but on the flip side is used by athletes to overproduce red blood cells beyond their natural limit. This increased red blood cell allows for greater oxygen carrying capacity. Make no mistake, Lu testing positive for PEDs is not shocking. But Lu getting caught in China is the real shocker here. Today's video, we're going to be talking about a couple of the plausible theories about what actually happened with Lu Xiaojun and his positive drug test. First thing I want to talk about, just get this out the way, it's not a good take to be like, are we all surprised? Of course we're not surprised. If we're shocked at this happening, the people who've been telling you for years that all the elite athletes or most of these athletes were taking performance enhancing drugs, if we're surprised that this happened, you just need to have a little bit more of analysis of this. You're just looking at the surface of this. Of course, nobody's surprised Lu Xiaojun was taking PEDs, or at least nobody involved in weightlifting to a certain degree is surprised. What is surprising is that a Chinese athlete was caught in China. This has, from what I can remember of weightlifting, has never happened before. Certainly a few, very few, and 3 come to my memory of Chinese athletes have tested positive in the last 20 odd years. 2 female athletes in the 2008 Beijing retest for growth hormone releasing peptides, and Lao Hui tested positive for boldenone, which was largely believed to be a setup either via a lack of money to pay the IWF around the time post his 2010 world record, or via some internal politics. So this is shocking. This is one of the most shocking things to happen in the entire decade plus that I've involved in weightlifting. Lu Xiaojun testing positive is something that I thought would never have happened. It truly is mental. So it's not a good take to be like, oh, are we surprised? Move on. Like, this really is something that is completely unheard of. Even Ilya, when he tested positive, was very, very shocking, but not shocking in regards that it actually happened, because you suspect a lot of these athletes are going to be taken down eventually. Most top athletes have at least one ban to their name. It's typically referred as the doping holiday, where they come back better than ever. But Chinese athletes don't have this doping holiday. This doesn't happen for them. So this to happen in a test done in China is immense.
Yeah, and I think before we go any further, just basically the subtext of our channel is we don't care. You know, like, this is an attack on anyone. Obviously, the individual himself is probably up the walls at the moment. It's probably a terrible, terrible time he's going through. So this is by no means an attack on him. It's by no means a gotcha. You know, oh, I'm glad now a Chinese athlete got caught. Yeah. Today's video is to give some context to it and some background. So I think the second piece that a lot of people are shocked by, and maybe shouldn't be quite so shocked by, is the fact that it's EPO. And I know a lot of the comments on our video yesterday and a lot of the comments just on Zach's video were about the use of EPO, and that's an endurance drug. Why would people use it? That's for marathon runners. So it's by no means unheard of in the strength and power training world that EPO would be used. And just to give you some context on this, when Dwayne Chambers, the British sprinter, was popped, in an effort to clear his name and in an effort to make sport cleaner, he kind of cut ties with Victor Conte of the Balco Lab scandal. And in the effort to clean everything up, he asked Victor Conte to write a full letter to UCADA, the United Kingdom Anti-Doping Agency, where he outlined everything he took. And it's a very, very interesting letter, massively informative on timings and dosages and how they dodge drug tests. But in that letter, Victor Conte talks about the use of EPO in power and strength sports. So just to give you a brief synopsis of this, EPO is used 3 days per week during the corrective phase. So the corrective phase is the first 2 weeks of the training cycle, typically Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays. It was only used once per week during the maintenance phase thereafter. So in their prep phases for training, these sprinters are using EPO to allow them to get more reps done on the track. So in the time when Lu was popped, in his preparation for World Championships, it makes absolutely perfect sense that they were using EPO. He goes on to talk about the use of EPO in strength and power sports afterwards, just allowing people to accumulate more meaningful volume during those prep phases. So that is something that when you start looking into it, does seem to be quite common.
So one of the stipulations, and this is actually something that a few of the commenters pointed out yesterday, when we were doing our live stream. So we found out mid-live stream we're just doing a Q&A. So this is their kind of more direct and thought out video on it. But a few people commented that if he was taking EPO, it's likely that he was, quote unquote, taking the kitchen sink, or they were throwing the kitchen sink at him. Generally referred to, if you're using EPO, which is something that's generally referred to as kind of exotic in the kind of recreational performance enhancing drug circuit, and then depending on the sport for elite level athletes, it would be used in certain scenarios, but it's certainly not a casual beginner cycle or beginner course or the go-to for most elite level athletes when they're trying to increase their performance. EPO is something that's largely reserved because it's hard to get and it is quite expensive and quite dangerous to use. So the fact that Lu was using EPO, and we'll get to that in a little bit, if he did actually use EPO, suggests that we may not be so worried about China using gene doping, and more probably along the lines of the political or the kind of iron curtain of China in terms of their drug testing, and probably using just traditional performance enhancing drugs alongside some maybe higher quality stuff.
In terms of detection time for EPO, to further Victor Conte's context on this, becomes undetectable after around 72 hours after subcutaneous injection into the stomach, and then only 24 hours after intravenous administration. So if those testers were in the country, it's interesting. At this time, China had a severe lockdown on, so I've seen 7 or 8 days of lock away. What do they call it? Quarantine.
Lock away.
Once you arrive in the country. So these testers must have been incognito, or they possibly could have been in country testing another group of athletes, and then kind of showed up impromptu, because these washout periods are not long.
Imagine my hand is a AC-130 flying below radar, flying in, just coming in low. Testers are wearing gas masks because they're coming from a high altitude drop, and they have their testing kits ready. And they're just going to be like, hello lads, just popping in.
Yeah, so the special Blackhawks they had for...
Oh, yes. They requisitioned the one that broke down. They got it on cheap on Alibaba. Okay, so moving on to our first theory, our first plausible theory. So we've kind of got 4 plausible theories, and there's been scenarios where all of these kind of happen throughout different sports. Now, the first one is essentially Occam's razor, or the most likely explanation is the most likely explanation, and the one you should go with until proven otherwise. And that is that the International Testing Agency, a newly set up body by WADA and the IOC to actually go test people because WADA was seen as inefficient and not able to do its job, is actually testing athletes and trying to catch them. We have some evidence for this. There's been a few named lifters in the last few years, in the last 2 or 3 years since the ITA has been set up, where they have caught people. Most notably, Dmitry Chumak was probably one of the first big names they got in weightlifting. The funny part about that, and essentially the really embarrassing part, or the second-hand cringe I get from this, was Dmitry Chumak tried to bribe them when they went to the testing in Ukraine, and they refused the bribe. And that was one of the first kind of bigger athletes, and Chumak would have been a world medalist and an Olympian for weightlifting. So Zacharias Bonat was tested as well most recently. So the very possible scenario, and I'm not sure I'm buying into it yet, we haven't seen a lot of names, and if we see more of this, then I'll be willing to secede to it. But I don't think this is the ITA and a new testing era for weightlifting. I think the other scenarios are probably more likely, but this is certainly a plausible scenario, and I'll be willing to hold my hands up if we see a lot more bigger name athletes getting caught by the ITA. But the first theory is the ITA are actually trying to test athletes and they're trying to catch them.
The second theory then is...
Wait, should I talk more about that?
Oh yeah, actually I will. So I think the big thing with the ITA is that the pressure is on, The pressure is on the IWF, the pressure is on the IOC, and then the pressure is on the combined WADA and ITA system. If weightlifting is to stay current, if weightlifting is to stay in the Olympic Games, which would be its kind of death blow if it was kicked out, the pressure is on now to be cleaning up the sport. And it's massively important that you start popping people from these big countries. So it is very, very likely that more of these missions, it is a mission they called it, isn't it?
Yes.
More of these missions will become an everyday occurrence, or certainly a more regular occurrence. I'm hugely surprised, though, that they did manage to pull it off in China.
Yeah, Call of Duty, WADA warfare. Yeah. Someone commented on our live stream yesterday. That was quite funny. One thing I do want to talk about, if the ITA are actually going testing people, is that I don't think this is good for the actual sport of weightlifting. Of course, stay in the Olympics. Before anyone comes at me, yes, I understand it's necessary for weightlifting to remain in the Olympics. It's very important for weightlifting, but we can hold two concurrent thoughts around this, that yes, I understand you need to stay in the Olympics for weightlifting to thrive, but at the same time, lower results just aren't interesting for weightlifting. And I know people talk about, the battles between lifters are interesting, but that's just not the case. Hence the popularity of Lu Xiaojun, a performance enhanced athlete, arguably the most famous weightlifter of the current crop, has been a performance enhancing drug user. And when we think about all the great events throughout weightlifting's history, it's all between athletes who are allegedly, almost certainly, or were proven to be using performance enhancing drugs. If we think about the greatest moments that you've been involved in weightlifting, or if you've been involved longer, you can take back further, that the performance in weightlifting and performance enhancing drugs are necessary for its popularity. We don't want to see super heavies clean and jerking 220. We don't want to see them go snatching 180 in terrible condition.
Yeah.
We don't want to see 77 kilo men snatching 135 and winning the Olympics. We don't want to see that.
If you're watching this video and you genuinely think you do want to see it, I just get you to think for a moment how many of the B group sessions you watched from the last World Championships. And that's, the battles still happen there. You'll probably have lifters from your own country in those groups, so you'll know some of the lifters there. The battles still happen there. The rule set is the same, and people are lifting weights at a high level, and doped athletes are still lifting weights in those B group sessions, but nobody watches them, because weightlifting is an inherently objective sport. That number is what makes it so great. That 200 kilos is 200 kilos everywhere in the world, and there's no ambiguity aside from some small judging miscalculations every so often. The objective nature of weightlifting is why we all love it so much, and those battles that you talk about happen in the B groups, but nobody watches them.
If you go look at Hook Grip, All Things Gym, Weightlifting House, YKS Media, 1 Kilo, any other number of people who bring us weightlifting footage from World Championships and Europeans and Asians, if you look at the most popular posts that they post and the most engaging comments are the best lifters. A lot of these lifters have test positive, will test positive, or are currently on and haven't tested positive just yet. And you're probably in the minority, and I think for some people aren't really thinking out the thought process if everybody was natural, because I think they're underestimating how many people are on performance enhancing drugs. One last thing I want to talk about in the testing, and we'll move on to the other theories, is while yes, China might be state sponsored, Russia might be state sponsored, many countries might be state sponsored doping or state involvement, not necessarily such large organizations. Other countries, and we brought up Victor Conte and it brings it in well, just because it's not state sponsored doesn't mean people aren't also using performance enhancing drugs in other countries, and it doesn't make it any better. It doesn't make you any more, I suppose, morally superior if your athletes are winning via a capitalistic route, via a private company like Balco Labs, or if it's state-sponsored CCP doping. It's one and the same in our book. It's just a different means, different ways of skinning the cat, And as we saw, Victor Conte was incredibly successful, and China was very successful. It's doping at the end of the day.
The second theory then is the sacrificial lamb theory. So this is that there's some sort of bartering going on. There's some sort of bargaining where you give us Lu, you give us a positive test for a big enough name, and the other lifters kind of get the free reign then, or they get tested less, or they get away with a small bit more, or possibly 5 or 6 positive tests get swept under the rug. And this is certainly something that happens quite regularly. Gregory Rodchenkov talked about it. He talked about having to actually choose the athlete that will get popped. Certainly when you look at it from a macro scale and you look at Lu's career and you look at the incredible achievements he's had, he fulfills that first need of being a big enough name, right? The ITA doesn't want to come and pop some random person. They want a big name just to make it look like everything is going well. So he certainly fulfills that bracket. He is the GOAT. He is a massive name in historical context. The second thing he fulfills then is the fact that his career is on a downward trajectory. Now, it would undoubtedly be it would be an incredible achievement if Lu went and won, as somebody in his late 30s, went and won another gold medal. That would be an incredible achievement. But it's very, very unlikely that would happen. In fact, it's unlikely Lu would medal at those games, just looking at the kind of shape he was in, the age he's at, the other people who are in those weight classes. So he definitely fulfills those two areas. His career is possibly on a downward trajectory, or was about to be on a downward trajectory, and he was a big enough name that the sacrificial lamb theory kind of makes sense.
Well, I definitely believe that this could have happened, and they definitely might have discarded him and had no more use for him, given that he probably wasn't going to medal again. I think this is a bad move if this is something that they did do, because he is essentially, Chinese weightlifting's golden boy, given the evidence that they're normally incredibly ruthless with their other athletes. If you Lu Xiaojun, if anyone remembers, from London, went to London with Lu, was also a 175 snatcher at 77 and was like an approximately 200 kilo clean and jerker. He was ruthlessly cut from the national team, from what I can remember, because he wasn't up to scratch, because there's so many other athletes. So popping the most prolific, most famous and most well accomplished Chinese male weightlifter, I don't think that's a good move if this is the thing they were going for. I think that's kind of silly, because it obviously casts the rest of his achievements in doubt, and I don't think that's a good. I could believe it happened. I could believe they're like, it doesn't matter, they know they'll get away with it. But in terms of optics, I think that's just a poor move. Now, moving on to the third theory, it's the sacrificial lamb theory, but Lu was an unwilling sacrificial lamb. So in the second theory, Lu could have easily been involved in this. They said, look, Lu, will you come back for another year? I know you said you were done last year, but come back for another year, do a little bit of training, we'll catch you. It's for the benefit of the whole national team, the future and current athletes. If you test positive, just do a little bit of training. You won't have to do any more competitions. You'll train nice and easy. Just get back to some numbers, make it obvious, and then we'll catch you or let you be caught. In the third scenario, Lu was brought back and was blissfully unaware that this was going to happen to him. And Gregory Chinkov does talk about that. He's saying, like I mentioned, in the Netflix documentary Icarus, and in his autobiography, he's talking about that he had to pick athletes to be kind of pushed forward and sacrificed essentially for optics, to keep the IOC happy, to keep WADA happy, and also to keep certain scenarios of those who knew, to let them know that they weren't going too far beyond what you should be doing, make it too obvious. And then for certain sectors in that group who weren't aware or who were blissfully ignorant of the scenario, were doing it so that it made it seem like they were actually testing athletes. And in this scenario, for whatever reason, they could have sacrificed Lu without telling him and made him the kind of golden sacrificial lamb without actually letting him know.
We really don't know what's going on behind the scenes here, and that's the thing. There is for want of a better term, an iron curtain around China. It's very rare we'll get kind of reliable information out of there. It's very difficult, as people living in a capitalist country that's fully democratic, that you can vote your leaders in. It's very difficult to imagine the situation that Lu is in currently. So in either of these sacrificial lamb scenarios, it's unlikely it's going to be good for Lu in the long term. Now, if he was the willing person and they said, Lu, here's $5 million to retire, it will set you up for life, that's probably the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is something a bit more malicious than that. So Lu had obviously set up Lu Xiaojun Barbell a number of years ago. That's gaining more and more popularity. Most business in China has some element of state sponsorship or state involvement, and it could be literally as simple as Lu getting a small bit too big for his boots and him just being pulled back a small bit. Like the influence of social media, the kind of whole attitude around social media and China is a very, very difficult one. It's difficult for people living in the West to even conceptualize how it is living in those countries, but hopefully this wasn't the case for Lu.
The fourth most plausible theory was that Lu was politically assassinated. This wasn't a sacrificial lamb scenario. The powers that be didn't want him caught, so it was either a rival in the team, a member of staff, or it could have been an outside influence via some international body, maybe the IWF for example, or it could have been a different country who were able to get him. You would be super surprised in these scenarios. For example, the political infighting between the factions was one of the rumor theories, which I mentioned for Lao Hui. He supposedly was a member of he was a member of the army team or the army division and lifted for those. And apparently, so one of the theories going around was that he pissed someone off, essentially, for the long story short, and then they tainted his supplement with something that was very obviously caught. Now, there's a couple of things with this theory that may argue for or against it. The first thing is that EPO is only administered injectably.
Via injection.
Via injection, that sounds right, injectably. The first thing is that EPO is administered via injection. So there is orally active EPO, but, and it's possible Lu has access to this. There is some studies done on it, but it's only, from what I can see, done in rats. The vast majority of EPO is injectable, and that's what it's used as, either intravenous or subcutaneous. So the orally active EPO is something that isn't really widespread. Now, it's very, very possible in a state-sponsored doping that it was easily obtained. There's a possibility that someone tainted some of his drinking or water with this and he tested positive around the time he knew he'd be tested. I think we all know that's probably unlikely. What's very likely here is that he was using an injectable version of EPO, and essentially he was injecting something else, and this is either tainted with it, or I suppose the water or the food could have been contaminated easily enough, and he was never been taking EPO. So there's a couple of different possibilities of this that we'll probably never know realistically, but in these scenarios, either he was using other drugs and they tainted those drugs with it, or they somehow got their hands on orally active EPO and tainted his food with it. So I think it's kind of lower down, but that's very espionage-y,
Yeah, I think that's the least likely of the situation or the circumstances. It's
But the thing is, though, is that the testers are in the country. EPOs that were mentioned in that letter from Victor Conte clears your system in 2 to 3 days, and there's some papers on that up to 72 hours. So something really strange happened where Lu was taking EPO around the time he was going to be tested. So what the explanation there is that the ITA really did sneak up on them.
Yes.
Which I find very unlikely. I can't imagine, given the years they've been doing this and the state-sponsored nature of this, that they didn't know he was coming. That's the strangest part about this.
Especially the climate in China right now is probably the most difficult time you could ever try and do an operation like this in China.
Yeah.
I can't imagine, with all the things that are locked down, with so much political unrest, I can't imagine this the easiest time for something like this to be pulled off, It's just crazy. I'd love to have the behind baseball view.
I'd love to have the behind the scenes when they're coming on the AC-130s, right, and then they're going paragliding down. And they're like the squirrel suits.
Joe, and the lights go off and they pull down the thermals.
But they're in their squirrel suits and they're kind of going, and they're like this, and it's like that God of Godzilla music is playing in the background, and they're heading for the training camp.
I have to imagine the B sample is sitting in like that thick perspex glass case, and there's someone just staring at it, being like, "Oh my God."
I'd love to know the testers. They must be so happy with themselves.
Yeah.
I wonder if they're watching the video right now.
So one thing I started thinking about last night was a lot of time people get caught in situations like this. So they're taking something with a known half-life, a known washout period, and then the testing changes. Like we've seen that with some of the SARMs and stuff even this year. I haven't seen any publications in my searching that there's any new testing after coming out. And as we talked about a few weeks ago, that actually has to be published prior to it coming out, or it kind of has to come out concurrently. And it doesn't seem as though there's suddenly like a kind of a vast test that will pick up these long-term metabolites,
See, the ITA might not have to operate like that or something, or maybe... Okay. See, a lot of times that wouldn't be... It's not that they have to do it, but in terms of legalese, when it comes to the WADA defending themselves from an athlete taking them to court, is that they'll show, like, I suppose that has been published,
Yes.
So they might not necessarily have to publish testing if they're very confident in its ability to show the presence of something.
One thing that comes to mind for me as well is that if an operation like this happened, right, if it's the first case where the ITA just goes, they show up, they drug test a load of athletes, and Lu got popped, and there's no funny business going on behind the scenes. Where are the other teammates' positive EPO tests?
Yeah.
People, it's not like Lu was the only one who would have taken EPO, right? So we talked about the use of EPO in strength and power sports. There's another stream running concurrently to this that Bogota is at altitude, and it could well have been used to kind of circumvent some of those negative effects of acclimatizing to altitude. Where are the other, like, they can't just show up and just test Lu.
Yeah.
Where's the other 6 positive tests?
So it was probably a blood test as well, which is interesting, so they went the full hog. I wonder if Lu knew at the time what was happening. We'll probably never know, Yeah. So that kind of thing where the other positive tests is that would suggest there's a lot of evidence to it being a political thing. And that's why I don't really buy, or I'm not really buying in yet, that the ITA is catching people unless they're politically compromised, because given the history of sport and what we know of sport around the world in all different organisations being incredibly corrupt, I don't buy that suddenly it's just allowed. I don't buy that. I don't think. I know people would like to think that, and that's perfect in your entitled to your beliefs, because we're all just operating on what we're looking at from the outside here. But I don't buy that, given past evidence that the ITA is suddenly going to be getting people who aren't in a place where they've been sacrificed or are not able to politically defend themselves. Ultimately, though, Lu Xiaojun tests positive. It's still crazy, lads. This is probably one of the most shocking things that'll ever happen in weightlifting. Aside from someone being a murderer or something. Lu Xiaojun testing positive is one of the craziest things that's ever happened in weightlifting. I think at any point. It's akin to Naim Sully running away from his Bulgarian handlers and fleeing to the Turkish embassy when they were in Australia and then going to lift for Turkey. Like, it's insane that this happened. Are you imagining Naim running away?
I can just imagine the short little legs. Thanks very much for watching. As always, we're really interested in your thoughts down below. We love these comment sections, so make sure you're scanning down the whole time as you're finishing off this video, and we'll talk to you all again soon.
Yeah, let us know which you think is the most plausible, or if there's any obvious theories that we might have missed, but I think we got them all.